Very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namrata Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer Teamwork Arts and the British Library, we welcome you to this session of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation, UK, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session this evening is Enlightenment Poems from the Theragatha and Therigatha, Andrew Schelling and Anne Waldman in conversation with Maitreya Bandhu. More than 2,000 years ago, the earliest disciples of the Buddha put into verse their experiences on the spiritual journey collected to form the Theragatha and the Therigatha, or verses of elder monks and verses of elder nuns, respectively. Andrew Schelling and Anne Waldman speak to Maitreya Bandhu about their translations of these poignant poems, bringing forth their visceral, immediate qualities. Andrew Schelling, poet and translator, has published 20-odd books of poetry, essay, and translations from Sanskrit, available in North America and India. Anne Waldman is the author, most recently, of Trickster Feminism, Sanctuary, Spuitun Daivel, and the album Shimaki. She is the translator, with Andrew Schelling, of Songs of the Sons and Daughters of Buddha. Her epic, The Lovish Trilogy, Colors in the Mechanism of Concealment, won the Penn Center USA Literary Award for Poetry. Maitreya Bandhu, won the Keith Shelley Prize, the Geoffrey Dermer Prize, and the Basil Bunting Award. He has published 3 collections with Blood Axe Books, The Crumb Road, a Poetry Book Society recommendation, Yarn, and After Cezanne. Our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Do please follow our handles, JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can log back on london.jlflitfest.org or find us on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Please do ask questions and comment by typing in the comment section. We encourage you and request you to please help us keep JLF London at the British Library a free festival by donating generously. The link is provided. And also please do support the British Library for all the work they do by donating. Ladies and gentlemen, Enlightenment poems from the Theragatha and Therigatha. Andrew Schelling and Anne Waldman in conversation with Maitriya Bandhu.
So thank you very much from everyone from JLK. No, I always get that nomenclature wrong, but thank you very much indeed. Really, really lovely to be here. Welcome especially to Andrew and Anna. I'm going to be talking to them about this wonderful and I think important book, Songs of the Sons and Daughters of the Buddha. My name is Maitriya Bandhu. I'm an ordained Buddhist. I live and work here at the London Buddhist Centre. Andrew and Anna are both in Colorado. One of the wonders of this modern world is that we can have this conversation together, even though we've got such difficult times. I hope you're both well. I'm just hearing some of the things that you're experiencing over there in Colorado. It's a very, very difficult time, isn't it, for everyone? But I'm hoping that today, by talking about this, we can focus on something of great value, because what people need at this time, and I think perhaps what people are being forced into, is having to ask very deep questions of their life. What is life for? What's the meaning of things? A lot of people at the moment suffering from anxiety, a lot of people suffering from loneliness, all the uncertainty and fear. So I couldn't, in a way, couldn't be a better time to look at these ancient songs from the disciples of the Buddha, people who've lived through much greater difficulties than we're living in and we're living through. But lovely to hear their voices in your wonderful translation. So what I wanted to do, I thought I'd start, I hope you don't mind this, Anne and Andrew, but I thought I'd start by asking the two of you, is this a book of poems or is it a religious text? Yeah, what do you think? If I'm, let's imagine I'm not a Buddhist. You have to imagine me without my kesa and my long Sanskrit name that nobody will be able to pronounce. If someone's coming along and they're picking this from the bookshelf, are they going to pick this from the poetry section or from the religious section or the spiritual section or the self-improvement section? Where are they going to find this, and what is this book? Let's start with you, Anne.
I'd say it's both from my perspective. I'm basically a poet in this and a Buddhist practitioner and so on. So I was inspired when I came across these texts when I was in a particular class studying at Naropa, and was very taken with these earliest poems, gathering of poems by women. So that was extraordinary. And then I've also been very involved with oral traditions and the sense of this, 350 years. So much can go on then. And the poems change and all sorts of things are entering in and so on. So that history, and then coming to the Pali Canon and this, setting it down in a particular way that didn't seem, absolute in some sense, that there was room to come back into this material as a poet. And also, I was particularly just recently when we were putting this edition together, very inspired by working in the time that we're in. You know, these are stories of women, mendicant women, wandering women. They're not nuns in a cloister. They're also, you know, had gone through all sorts of hardships with difficult, you know, mother-in-law, loss of children, illness. Some of them have been prostitutes. And so there's so many stories within this that felt, you know, with our time of, you know, homelessness and so on, and people finding, trying to find a spiritual path. You know, it just seemed very relevant also to, you know, so my sense of it, for me, it's a spiritual text in many ways, you know, the relief of coming to the Dharma and letting go and seeing through everything, you know, pretty clearly. And then, you know, the sense of when you find it, you can't go back. Yes, you know, that's indeed what I get, that kind of process of coming to realization.
Indeed. I'm going to come back, Anna, to you in a moment about you and your poetry and how the two have linked for you. But Andrew, what do you think about this thought? You know, Anne saying it's a spiritual and a you know, work of poetry. What do you think about that? Where am I going to pick this up? What do I want to get from this book?
Well, I would hope you would get both from it. One of the things Anne and I have tried to do is reinstate both poetry, but also to some extent, a sense of delight and fun about these old songs or poems. I think they've been buried for so long under a kind of piety that it was as though they had become very dry, and we were supposed to approach them with solemnity and awe and all the sort of trappings that the West has so much put around its religious traditions. I've worked for many years with Sanskrit language, the Pali, which this comes from, some medieval Hindi of the Bhakti poets, and I think for what I can tell, most of India's history, that wouldn't have even been a question, is this poetry or is it religion? That there was not so much sense that these two things need to be separated. It seems to me very much a kind of Western dualism to want to divide sense of aesthetics and fun and joy from the seriousness of religious quest. And I think part of what makes these things so attractive is that they compress Buddhist teachings using all the techniques of poetry rather than the kind of vocabulary or jargon that religious texts tend to fall into. And Anne mentioned that these come out of an oral tradition, and one of the things that happens in oral traditions is you get a great deal of repetition, even repetition from text to text, poem to poem, song to song, and that's a lot harder for people who read it. So we've made several changes to the poems, including eliminating repetition that doesn't work so well on the page. It works great if you're listening to singing or you're listening to oral presentation. So what we've tried to do is take these songs that feel like they've been buried for too long and translated with an excessive delicacy and piety and reinstilled them with some of the life force that they had originally. This is not to say that the poems are coming out of fun or joy all the time. There's enormous suffering in them, but one of the transmutations of suffering is to turn it into authentic expression, authentic testimony, and to cast it into, an aesthetic context by singing or making poetry out of it.
I mean, that's one of the things I've really loved about the book is, I've got this gold figure behind me, and sometimes I think that we put too much gold leaf on the Buddha and on the Buddha's disciples. And as you say, you end up with this rather, very easily, particularly in Buddhist, in texts that's come down to us, they end up slightly frozen. And I think both of you, and Andrew, you breathed new life into them. They're speaking again as persons in a quest for the truth. It's very notable reading the book that you've rediscovered the life within them and sort of taken off perhaps some of the gold leaf. Would you agree with that? Would that be what you were trying to do here?
Yes, I would say so. And they've had, in the past, the Rhys Davids translations, versions that are very sort of Christianized.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Overlaying their own, reality or projection or something of that kind. And I think, for me, it was more being in the time that we're in, the Kali Yuga, if you want to call it that, maybe just the beginning. And so I'm feeling connected to, to these difficult times back then. And also, some of these are at the time of the Buddha. That's incredible to me. So you have this kind of direct transmission in a way that's gone through different, struggle and then being interpreted and so on. So that, I guess the idea of getting, what was the direct kind of trajectory, and there's, the guilt comes off. The ways that we find, I don't think we're trying to turn it into, contemporary slang necessarily, or anything like that. But they're, things that come in that feel kind of timeless for me.
Indeed, yeah.
So I would agree. That was we were inspired. Why would we do other versions? Why would we take this on? And I think we were able to lend, our own enthusiasm, and as Andrew said, a kind of joy. I mean, when you have that sense of, insight, realization, you see through, the fabric and the spectacle, and you're getting at the heart of the connectivity to impermanence, to the Four Noble Truths, etc. They become, the poems themselves become these kinds of transmissions, if you will, and they're, but they can also work in this other way. And they, the fact that they were speaking, out of that voice, and I think our decision to name the poems, the names of the singers and speakers and so on, and then you have the, you have these the Dharmapala stories. So in bringing in some of the details of their lives, the daughter of escaping the family, the difficult, situation here, losing a child, going out on the road. And they're on the road, which is such a trope for, contemporary poetry and poetics from the Beat generation and Kerouac's On the Road. These are literally on the road in a very, maybe similar way as seekers. And, there's one point where it was actually Andrew who said, imagine being a young person in our, like somebody in our culture who drops out and wants to, latch onto something, go on a spiritual path, and you're dealing with, the difficult Brahmin parents or whatever it is. And, that made it sort of put it back. It wasn't just the elders, the Tera and Teri are elders, but also that a young person and seeker in a difficult political time and so on in India and so on. Anyway, that they're jumping up and wanting to leave. And there's one poem that I worked on, which is, seekers, the father saying, seekers, you go on and on about the seekers. And she says, well, they're better than this, and they do that, and they're friendly, and they want to be, they're welcoming, and that's what I feel part of. I'm going to drop out and join this band of merry pranksters. That's what it sounds like.
And I think that gets very much to the spirit of Buddhism, that sense of I want this quest. I want something more than what you're offering me. I don't believe in what you're offering me. I mean, it's interesting how I love the fact that you sometimes put the stories with the poems. I really like the fact that you put the names, because it brings the speaker very close to us. At times they look almost like Indian Haibung, don't they? A sort of to go backwards in history. I want to say a bit more. I want to come back, obviously, to say more about it. But I thought it'd be good also to introduce you, because translation is a thankless task. It's a very hard task. It takes a lot of work. And it's easily the translators don't. In the old days, that you wouldn't have even got it to the front cover. The translator used to be on the back somewhere, hidden away. So I want to also make sure we focus on you, and you're both poets in your own right. I wanted to ask you about how you you moved from Buddha to poetry to Buddhism? Was it that way round? What was the quest for you, briefly, just to hear a bit about your own lives, because that your lives are refracted in these poems as well, because the translator's not just finding word for word translations there, they're reimagining it, as you've said. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that. Perhaps start with you, Andrew. Oops, Andrew seems...
Sure. I think it was really poetry that brought me to Buddhism. I had, as a young man, been reading particularly Chinese and Japanese poetry in translation, and most of it was infused with a kind of Buddhist spirit. Some of it was really explicit, and it showed me really alternative values to what I thought was a prevalent mood of my nation. And so I began to explore that material. And then I started to discover that a lot of the fine translators were modern or contemporary poets, and that led me into the poetry there. So I began by reading translations by Ezra Pound, Gary Snyder, Sid Corman, Denise Levertov, and beginning to see this Buddhist Hindu world being drawn into America. And it, gave me an access to poetry and an access to my own culture that I wouldn't have had otherwise. At some point, I got very interested in and committed to Buddhism and began to study Sanskrit. And it was such a delight to begin to find this kind of material there, which nobody else had really readily translated for Americans. I like what you said about like taking the gold leaf off of the Buddha in a way. And one of the appeals of so much of the Asian poetry that I found first in the Chinese and Japanese, but also in these old Indian poetries, is they weren't dressed up or gussied up. They weren't fancy. In a way, these really hit the sensibility of our modern times. I like to say we moderns don't like our poems dressed up too much. We've sort of gotten rid of all the old ornamentation that felt so alienating when you go back a century or two into poetry, and we want something very direct. We want the emotion on the surface rather than buried away under ornamentation or decoration or frills or something. And when you go into the Theragatha and Therigatha, wow, these things are raw. I mean, they're, raw and, sort of unrefined, and that's the attraction of them. It hits the way that we want to speak in contemporary times and really address, our issues, our interests, our loves, our fears, all of that, without hiding it, under excessive meter or fancy language or something. And so finding these poems was really, like a cycling back to the poetry that had originally pulled me into Buddhism.
Interesting, and I like what you said about them being raw, because later on, before we finish, I'll definitely ask the two of you to read one, because we must hear one, because I really like the rawness of them. I think I think that gives back Buddhism its voice, uncovered with gold leaf. But Anne, how did you? Again, you're a poet in your own right. How did you come to? Was it poetry to Buddhism, Buddhism to poetry? What was your own journey?
Well, similarly to what Andrew was saying about reading, through reading and discovering that so many poets were into this material as well. And you had, Rex Roth translating Pound, of course, as Andrew mentioned. And I think the letter, the merchant's wife and so on, that letter that I had in high school. So I had a very good religion teacher also in high school, and we were looking at Taoism and Zen Buddhism, and not so much tantric Tibetan Buddhism, but this was a sort of framework. And then I was interested a little bit in the Sufi traditions, and I was drawn to Asian forms and kind of open forms in Indian music with the alap and the sort of possibilities of being very formal in a way, but also spontaneous and exploratory and improvisational. So those forms were interesting. Indian dance, and growing up in New York, we have the Asia Society and other places where you could encounter direct teaching. And then I was, by the time, I think I was 18 when I met the great Lama Geshe Wangyal, who had come on a Tolstoy Foundation grant to New Jersey and living in a pink suburban house with his monks and doing this translation work. And some of the Harvard crew were there, Thurman, the great translator and scholar and so on, who's at Columbia still and very, very active, and others. And I was drawn into, and I couldn't quite get the gender situation was a bit problematic because there were primarily male teachers, the monks. I was encountering them. It wasn't until I went to India and saw, more of a presence of women, as Chatra Rinpoche's, daughter is his Dharma heir and that sort of thing. So that was, I think, really key for me, coming upon the Therigatha as these, women voices. So, and then at a fairly early age, taking teachings and then coming to work at Naropa at the invitation of Chogyam Trungpa, Rinpoche, and so on. So having, this kind of blessed sort of fortuitous connection, but it was with looking into the more, we call it, not the official verse culture of our time, but this more, sometimes, referring it to as a kind of left-hand path or a different way in the actual experience, that you feel very connected to the descriptions of coming to, reality, existence, the questioning and so on, and that it's done so, this raw way, but actual way where you feel that hit. And so, this was very important in poetry in general, that you felt that sense of, lifted up. These connections are made through the language, through the sound, and so on, and you feel that, you get it. And one of our slogans at Naropa was, what is the role of poetry, especially in this context of a school inspired by the contemplative practice and so on, but it's to help wake the world up to itself. So I felt, with these particular texts, I was being awakened to a world, that existed in some other time or through times and is still very, relevant. So that was key for me. And, I sometimes worry about the business of, the poet and the identity of the poet and the careerism of all that in the arts and so on. And that's a question that students come with, how can you connect, this pursuit, which is so individual in a way, and dark night of the soul too, emptiness, and shedding and not having, so much focus on the person who's doing. So, it's a delicate balance, but it's been, such a, strength for many, many years, and especially in these times of difficulty and, being in sequester or being, challenged by things all around that are going on, as we, very much aware of that. It becomes additionally, helpful. And I found this, putting together this book, Andrew and I were meeting, in the summer and working on it, and then the proofs were coming, and it was getting more and more relevant.
Indeed. Yeah.
There's a lifeline.
I want to talk a bit about that relevance, because the thing that's been striking me looking at them again, and of course this is absolutely, central to Buddhism. My own teacher, again, Sangharakshita, he says that you could boil Buddhism down to one word, and that word would be impermanence. If you had to come up with one word, and these songs of the sons and daughters of the Buddha, their impermanence runs as a major note through all of them, doesn't it? And it strikes me that in these difficult times, and it's not just COVID that's difficult, we all know there are so many difficulties, everything that's been exploding around race. And one of the things that I found coming to this is coming back to those great issues of impermanence, the brevity of life, what you're going to do with your life, given that it's brief and very difficult for many people, and wonder whether you might say a little bit about the song of impermanence that runs through this this book and collection.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's like the bass note that is struck through all of this, and part of it you see because almost all the sort of longer ballad-like songs tell the tale of the person's life, the man or woman who has left a former lifestyle to join this kind of wandering order of seekers. And often it's come because they've been hit by impermanence. They've lost their family, they've lost their money, they've lost their crops, whatever their life is they've come out of has been marked by tragedy. And they understand that everything they had counted on is no longer there for them. It might be a flood, it might be a drought, it might be the death of a child, it might be the loss of their caravan, it might be, any of a number of things. And one of the wonderful qualities that Buddhism maintains, and you find all the way back with these very early poets, is that at that moment of realization, when the poet, or just let's say the person who's come to recognize impermanence, decides to move another direction, they get a new name, as though even their identity has not been impermanent or not been permanent, or their previous identity was based on a delusion. And now they can move forward with a name and an identity that is more appropriate to the way the world actually is. So quite a few of these old songs, I think these are, in a way, the most mysterious. They're very short ones, but they're naming poems, and they're based on kind of, not really puns, but working with somebody's name. They're given a name, and then they make a song or a poem about it, which encapsulates the lesson that is now held inside of your name. You would just explain to us, Maitreya Bandhu, that your name means something like brother of friendship or brother of friendliness. And, when you are given that name, not your name from birth, but it signifies that there's been a major awakening of some sort, a new aspiration, a stepping away from a belief in the old value system. And that's something very charming about these. And the fact that they're put into poems is so delightful. And a great many of them are, raw, strikingly honest, from our points of view, sometimes even very comical, not probably comical to the original singers, but I think, there's like almost a cosmic delight and cosmic laughter that you can hear when you realize that you've allowed yourself to be duped by the universe by believing all sorts of stupid things, about the permanence of your bank account, your money, your automobile, your friendships, your relatives. And when it comes to pass and you realize that actually all that stuff that you were standing on was just froth, and now you're standing on something more real. I think one of the responses is such relief that it actually has some humor to it. You can look back at yourself and say, how could I have been so foolish? And you need a sense of humor. You're not going to be able to move forward without that sense of humor. So, the impermanence goes along with a number of emotions. The one that would often be paired with it in Buddhism would be compassion. Yeah. But I think in these poems, I would pair almost like a sense of humor about, the awakening to how duped you had been in your previous lifetime.
We talk about this in the intro. I'm sorry. We talk about this in the introduction. The sense of deliberately, living a life deliberately, and quoting Thoreau, of course. And this sense of, getting away from this quiet desperation that is spoken of. And so, you're in touch with all these luminous details of what you're dealing with, what is left behind. I'll just give an example, reading this is the Sumangala's mother. So Sumangala's mother was the wife of a weaver of straw hats. I'm free, free from kitchen drudgery, no longer a slave among dirty cooking pots. My pot smelled like an old water snake, and I'm through with my brutal husband and his tiresome sunshades. I purge lust with a sizzling sound. Pop! Oh, happiness, meditate upon this as happiness. So just those details of the, the pot smelling like a water snake, and the thing that her, husband is wearing, these tiresome sunshades. I find it hilarious. Yeah. And also, we talk about this too, the presence of Mara, the tempter.
That's right. That's the other thing I was going to mention.
And so there's a kind of interesting dialogue that goes on there. And then you feel again this sense of deliberation, the choice, the commitment, and you can even, hold your own with Mara. So that's often a interesting dynamic. And I think you wanted us to read a few of these, or?
Well, it'd be nice to hear some. Just go back for a moment to the name poems, because I am again struck by the profundity of naming. Like when I was given my name, there is a sort of going forth from the past and an embracing of a path. But a name is also something to really live up to. My name means friendly, basically, and that's a terrible thing to live up to, I can tell you. But yes, sorry.
No, I was going to say my Buddhist name is Dechen Chomsok.
And what does that translate as?
Well, it's sort of bliss of. It's related to water, but a kind of. But the name Dechen is so close to Anne, and it's a very common name. So that was interesting to me. So, eternal Dharma bliss, that kind of thing, as vast as the ocean.
Yeah.
But it means something. And then there are other, with certain transmissions, you get other more secret names you don't speak, but they're held in you as a kind of guide. You want to live up to your name.
Right, of course.
But I agree, it's very profound, that kind of naming.
So perhaps, Andrew, why don't you read, we've just heard one of the Therigatha. Let's hear one of the Theragatha, one of the monks. It'd be nice to hear just a few shorter ones, perhaps, just so that people listening in can get a sense of them.
Sure, I'll read just a few stanzas from a young man named Ratapala, who is sort of magically picked up and swept into a king's court and begins to give the king certain instructions that Ratapala has learned by his questing as a Buddhist. And so here's just a couple of stanzas. A king who's conquered every acre of land up to the sea gets restless and bitter. He can't rest till he's taken the distant shore also. Not just a king, but any man arrives at death twisted with craving, sheds his body, but still hasn't tasted enough pleasure. Relatives mourn him, their hair matted with grief. They cry in bewilderment, he wasn't immortal, and carry him out in a shroud, build a pyre, and immolate him. He is burnt, prodded with insulting long poles. He's wrapped in a sheet, but his wealth stays behind. Friends, relatives, neighbors, no one protects him. Heirs take his money and land. The dead creature takes only his karma along.
I mean, that's a really, really good one to choose, because it really shows how uncompromising these poems are and how uncompromising these practitioners were. I think sometimes Buddhism has got a very soft press. People think it's very soft and lovely and relaxing, but what you get from reading these songs is uncompromising breakthrough, don't you? So often, an absolute commitment to the most uncompromising truth of things. Yeah, that's very, very striking. A wonderful translation, so alive. And would you choose one that you perhaps particularly?
Yeah, I have two fairly short ones, but the Punika the slave. Still prideful after numerous auspicious births, Punika was reborn a slave at Savatthi in the household of Anatha Pindika, the treasurer. She won her master's esteem after turning an Udaka Sudrika to the Dharma. Her master freed her and consented that she enter the order of Theri. Punika, I'm a water carrier, slave to my mistress's anger. Bitter winter, I'm down by the freezing Chiravati drawing water. But what frightens you, Brahmin? What makes you go to the river? Your limbs are shaking from the cold. Don't you know, Punika? I'm performing this ablution to prevent evil. Whoever commits evil is saved by washing in water. Punika, whoever told you washing frees you from evil karma? Ridiculous superstition, the blind leading the blind. If that were true, fish and turtles would swim in heaven, along with frogs, water snakes, crocodiles, sheep butchers, pork butchers, fishermen, animal trappers, thieves, executioners, all free from bad karma after splashing themselves with water. Not to mention all kinds of other despicable rogues. If these streams carried away evil, they would carry away your virtue cold. And then another quick one. This is Siha, who's thinking about suicide. She thought of suicide, but gave it up singing. Distracted, too passionate, dumb about the way things work. I was stung and tossed by memories, haunted, you could say. I went on like this, wandering for 7 years, thin, pale, desperate, nothing to hold me. Taking a rope, I went to the woods. Hanging is better than this low life. The noose was strong. I tied it to the branch of a tree, flung it around my neck, when suddenly, look, it snapped. Not my neck. My heart was free.
Really wonderful. I mean, what you get there again is that incredible humor, as you say, that again it tends to get sort of gold leafed out of Buddhism, doesn't it? But that sort of laughter at absurdity, but also in the first one, you really get that sense of the stand against being superstitious. Again, my own teacher talked to Buddhism as being enlightened common sense. And you get that, don't you? That enlightened common sense. Don't be ridiculous. And her talking to a Brahmin like that is very, very serious indeed. It's actually would be considered very, very rude. So remarkable kind of chutzpah to that poem. So thank you very much.
Andrew,
Really
you should
lovely.
read another.
Yeah,
Read another of the
Yes.
men.
Okay, I'll go to Ma.
We'll need to finish with this one, I think. But let's have that. Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Good. Gotama, how many lifetimes I spent wandering hell realms? Then was I born where ghosts rage with insatiable thirst. I took animal shape how many times? Finally born human, I lived among phantoms, stumbled in darkness, went places where nonsense mixed with reality. These lives never had substance. They wobbled and drifted. When I realized they were just my own mind, I finally reached a place called tranquility.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And that's a wonderful place to finish our discussion. I'm very sorry that we haven't got more time to talk, but how right to finish with the word tranquility. A tranquility that's not an escape from pain, but a seeing through of pain to a deeper kind of consciousness, the consciousness of a Buddha. So thank you very much, Andrew. And really, really lovely to meet you. I'm really delighted that you've taken the gold leaf off the Buddha figure and his disciples and had them speak to us in a language that we can relate to in these very, very difficult times indeed. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and of course, Maitreya Bandhu. Thank you for this incredible session. And thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We want to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. We do hope that you will stay with us for our remaining 2 sessions today and will join us tomorrow to watch more of our fabulous program. at the JLF London at the British Library. Our next session today, which will begin in conversation with Achal Malhotra.
This is an excerpt from the author's note from my book Across the Line, which is rooted in the partition of the subcontinent. This book probably started writing itself many years ago, owing to an unspoken conversation. One that I wish I'd had, but didn't. I was about 10 years old, and as we always did over the school holidays, my parents, my brother and I journeyed from Kolkata to my grandparents' farm in a little village in North India. At the time, I didn't know that my grandparents had spent their childhood and youth in Rawalpindi, Lahore and Theragatha in present-day Pakistan. I didn't know that they had arrived in New Delhi as refugees in 1947, alongside millions of others with just the clothes on their back, having lost loved ones in an upheaval so deeply traumatic that it never found mention in our conversations. Except perhaps that one time, had I stayed and spoken. Afternoons at the farm were sweltering, too hot for tractor rides or skimming stones in the canal or splashing around in the tube well, which is what my brother and I would usually spend the rest of the day doing. So our afternoon ritual was to laze around on the divan in my grandfather's study. Some days my grandfather would ask us to select a book from his huge collection of Urdu novels and poetry, and then he would read to us. Having grown up in Rawalpindi, he was fluent in Urdu but couldn't read Hindi. I couldn't read Urdu but could understand it enough to get by. So this arrangement worked pretty well for me, although my brother, who was younger, would usually wander off to play with our cook's son instead. One afternoon, I selected a book and handed it to my grandfather. He looked at it, hesitated ever so slightly, and then told me that it was a collection of short stories by Saadat Hasan Manto. And the story he chose to read to me was called Toba Takes Him. By way of backdrop, my grandfather explained that the story was set in a lunatic asylum a few years after the partition. It began with the governments of Pakistan and India having decided to swap their lunatics along religious lines, just as they had done with the rest of their people, so that all Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims ended up on the right side of the border. I remember thinking that this was a rather silly plotline, but there was little else to do, so I listened. Manto's dark satire as to who then were the real lunatics was lost on me, of course. I can still remember my grandfather's voice assuming different intonations as he read. He had me in splits as he muttered the well-known rant of the story's protagonist. I had no clue of its context, but it sounded nonsensically amusing. Between peals of laughter, I looked up to notice that my grandfather had stopped reading. He sat slumped forward, his hands covering his face, his shoulders convulsing as he sobbed. I had never seen my grandfather cry before, or ever after, but that day, my otherwise fearless grandfather, who had braved lathi charges and prison in the fight for independence, wept. At a loss for what to do, I went to call my grandmother. In stunned silence, I watched her comforting him as if he were a little child, murmuring, "Chaddo, mitti pao," which meant, "Let it go, bury it." And then I quietly left the room. Later that evening, I remember hiding that book behind all his other books, so I would never happen to take it out again and never have to see my grandfather cry. What I didn't do was ever ask him what caused those tears. The regret still leaves me feeling empty. As the years went by, my grandparents shared countless anecdotes about their early years in undivided India, the pranks they would get up to with their friends at school, the street plays they would stage to protest against British rule. Their stories were peppered with fond anecdotes of their neighbors, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, who had lived next door for generations. I would listen enraptured, piecing together the fragments in my head, imagining the people and places that once made up their world. Yet, what they never spoke about was the events surrounding the partition itself. Perhaps it was just too painful to reopen the wounds. Perhaps, as refugees, grief was a luxury they could ill afford. Or perhaps gaining independence had demanded center stage instead. I sometimes wonder, on each Independence Day, did they also quietly mourn who and what they'd lost in the aftermath? This book, then, is my attempted tribute to a generation of quiet heroes on either side of the border, who silently bore the brunt of a cataclysmic rupture in their lives. A generation that wordlessly erased its past and gave their all to building our future. And most strikingly, a generation who, despite everything they had been through, harbored no malice. Maybe because they had seen firsthand that there were no good and bad people, that alternatively the aggressors had also been the victims, that an eye for an eye did indeed make us blind and easier to manipulate by those whom it suited. I'd like to think that perhaps this story chose me to allow me a chance to make amends in some small way for not finding the words when I should have. I hope these words do make a difference to someone, somewhere.